Hey, what's up, everyone? A few weeks ago, I delivered a seminar for the Squash Ontario family here in Canada. And recently, on several of my videos, you guys have been asking about the fitness side of things. This webinar covers a whole bunch of stuff related to fitness, and then I link it back to squash as well. It gives you the foundations, the overview of a lot of the things you need when you want to think about programming fitness. And the real reason behind why I wanted to do this was because nowadays, if you go online, you go on Instagram, you go on YouTube, there are tons of people talking about all sorts of fitness things. And in many cases, they're just demonstrating exercises, especially on Instagram. I'm not on TikTok, so I don't know what's going on there. But a lot of times we see these really cool exercises, and they have a specific purpose and a function and a time and a place, but none of that context is given when we see these videos online. So my hope through this webinar is to, and was to, show the audience there, and now I'm hoping to share it with you, with the intention of seeing what the foundations of fitness look like, seeing how you can actually create a program, how to change the program, how to adapt, how the body adapts, what performance looks like over time, what cardiovascular fitness goals might look like, so many things. And on that note, I'm going to share with you the list of what this webinar covers. So if you take a quick look, you're going to see there's a massive list over there. I talk about all of this over the next hour in the webinar. So check it out. I'm not going to read the list out to you because I know that you can read. That's what you're going to get out of it. I highly encourage you to watch the entire video and leave a comment, share your feedback, like the video if you like it, obviously. And I appreciate your continued support with the channel. Let's have a discussion about all of these elements and share whatever else you guys would also be keen to see. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video. So first thing, like I said, critical fundamental ideas is what we're going to talk about. Then we're going to talk about some practical tools and then some samples and suggestions. Now, there's no way to say anything's going to be perfect. So what I'm going to share is going to be really helpful for some people, but there's this customized aspect. So, my fitness level is different from your fitness level and different from your needs based on your body and all that kind of stuff. So everything's going to be holistic. And if you have specific questions, we can dive into those as well. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about was what I consider the foundation of fitness. And it is this idea of adaptation. So if I say the word or write the word adaptation, what does that mean to you guys? Or how can you relate adaptation to fitness? And you can put your hand up, unmute yourself. I'd love to hear from you. If you feel more comfortable typing in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, go ahead, Kathy.
I would just say, to me, if you're training, your body adapts to the level you get to. And as it gets to a certain level, then something becomes easy for you. That means your body's adapted to it. You're ready for the next challenge and put another stressor in.
Absolutely. Thank you. And you mentioned the word stressor, and we can also write the word stimuli. So, the idea is that we need to give our body stimulus in order to help it adapt and continue to grow. So I'm going to share one little example with you. It's like a performance time chart. So, and you can see, even though I love writing, I'm not very good at it yet. So this is performance, or you can also think of this as like baseline fitness. If this is your starting point, every time you train and you put a stimulus into your system, your performance and your system actually deteriorates a little bit at first. And then it's the rest and recovery that actually helps you get stronger or surpass your baseline. And then the next time you train, you take a little dip, and then the next time you recover, you increase. And the goal over time is to try to make this moving upward. So that's the goal when it comes to just adaptation and stimulus. And the thing here is that when we think of stimulus or we think of stress, we often think of stress as having this negative connotation with it. but there's a positive side of stress and then there's a negative side of stress. So fitness is all about giving yourself positive stress. But what I did want to talk about is this idea of like stress overall. So if you think of your life and you can think of it as like a bucket, you have different layers in your life that are causing stress. So one of this might be poor sleep. So poor sleep takes a toll on your body. You might have like stress from work or exams or something like that. That takes a toll on your body. You might have relationship stress. That takes a toll on your body. You might have all sorts of stresses. And even though you're not training hard, you might actually be overloading yourself and be spilling in terms of your stress cup. And that can lead to injury. It can lead to burnout. It can lead to all sorts of things. So I wanted to share this up front because this is a concept that's missed by a lot of people. Is they're like, I'm just going to train and I'm going to train hard. When I'm tired, I'm going to train. When I do all this, I'm going to train. But if we're not deliberate and particular about how we're doing this, instead of this chart going upwards, what ends up happening is even with little stimulus, this chart will come here and then you're not going to recover, and it's going to come here and you're not going to recover, and it's going to come here and you're not going to recover, and you're going to end up in this downward trajectory. And at some point, your injury and your burnout are going to start taking place over here. So holistically, please keep that in mind when you're thinking about your own fitness. And the best way to do that is over time, you get to learn about your body. You listen to your body. You get that intuition about, hey, how's my body feeling? And then you can adjust and adapt accordingly. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Now, I'm going to share a practical example with you about this adaptation piece. So how many of you guys have actually, even before I go there, one piece of homework for you guys that I would encourage you to consider is create this little chart, this little bucket for yourselves, and list the stressors in your life, and they're positive or negative stressors. List the stresses in your life and think about how highly stressed you are, with kind of the top being a 10 out of 10 and the bottom obviously being a 0 out of 10. And then see what your stress levels are. And if your stress levels are super high, I would not encourage you to do very intense training. If your stress levels are low, you can engage in more intense training. And if you're too stressed out, your body's not going to have the energy to actually adapt. So that's a little piece of homework for you guys I would encourage you to do, and just generally think about when you're training. Now, here's a practical example. So how many of you guys have played squash and have felt gassed, like exhausted, huffing and puffing, legs are burning, all that kind of stuff? Nice. Okay, pretty much everyone. So the thing here is there's this idea, and I'm not going to get into the science behind it, but there's this idea of your aerobic and anaerobic threshold. I'm just using this as an example. But basically what happens is when our legs get really, really burnt up and they get heavy and you feel like you can't even run that much anymore, or you're gasping for air because you can't get enough air in your system, that means you are past your anaerobic threshold. So one of the main things of fitness, and I'm sharing this as an example of adaptation and stimulus, one of the main things in fitness is if you come here, don't worry about this axis. You can think of this as like blood lactate, or you can think of it as your heart rate. These are all kind of correlated in different ways. And this is intensity. So what ends up happening is if you work out at a low intensity, your heart rate and stuff stays pretty stable. But there comes a point when your intensity goes up that it suddenly spikes. And generally this spike over here is referred to as your anaerobic threshold. Anaerobic. Does anyone want to know the details of aerobic versus anaerobic, or should I just keep going with the example? I don't know how much science you guys want to get into. I'm just going to keep going unless someone stops me. So this is kind of your anaerobic threshold. So all this means is that, hey, when my heart rate hits, I'll use heart rate as an example because it's easier to understand. When my heart rate hits 120 beats per minute, I'm going to start burning up in my legs, or I'm going to run out of breath when I'm training. Now, do you want to have your intensity where you start burning out to be way higher, like let's say all the way over here? Or do you want your intensity to be here? Which intensity do you think is going to be more effective in sport? Do you want to burn out at a higher intensity, or do you want to burn out at a lower intensity? Kathy, I saw that you were saying something, but you're muted, so I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I would say higher.
Yes. So the goal is that you want to push your fitness level as high as you can so you don't burn out as quickly. That's the idea. So, when you think about like marathon runners, you think about elite marathon runners. How is it that I'm forgetting the gentleman's name, but he ran the marathon in 2 hours, like sub 2 hour. How is it that he can maintain a pace that most of us can't even sprint at for 2 hours? Well, what he's done is through training, he's pushed his anaerobic threshold so far back that he can maintain this insane intensity and still not get to that point where he's totally wiped out. That's the value of training. So when you think of squash, you can think of squash on like a muscular fitness level. So like how strong you are, how much muscular endurance and strength you have. You can think of it from a cardiovascular perspective, like how long can I run for before I wipe out kind of thing. And the goal is to push that threshold as far back as possible. Okay. And soon we're going to talk about different ways in which you can do that as well. But I wanted to set the stage for this. And if any of you guys are cyclists or runners or anything like that, you can think about this exact same idea. For cycling, you would have watts over here. Generally speaking, that's what they measure in cyclings. So if you wipe out at 100 watts, your goal is to train as close to 100 watts as possible to push that up to 150 and then keep pushing that up as high as you can. With running, it's the same thing. If you can run at like 5 miles per hour on the treadmill, well, you want to push that up to 6 and then keep going as like your sustenance. So for squash, you can think of this as ghosting, for example. That's one way to think about it. So how fast can you ghost? So right now, maybe you'll say, I'm going to ghost for 1 minute, and I can maintain like a 1 minute pace of ghosting. Let's say 1 minute on, 1 minute off forever if I do 10 shots in a minute. Well, if you see a professional, the professional might be able to maintain 1 minute on, 1 minute off at like 23 shots in a minute because they've built up their threshold of intensity really, really far. So this would be like an example of a measure where maybe you start at 10 and you try to go to 12 and then 14, because all that means is that you're going faster and you're doing more work in a set period of time. Now, unfortunately, there's no like standardized way of measuring this in squash right now. It's something I'm actually trying to work on, just in case you're curious, to kind of gauge fitness levels for squash like that. But overall, I wanted to share this with you guys so you understand the foundations here. So let me just scroll through my notes for a second. So now, actually, does anyone have any questions about what we've talked about so far? No? Okay, awesome. Nice and clear. Let me clean this board. So I'm going to very quickly introduce just a few concepts that I'd encourage you guys to think about. One of them is this idea of progressive overload. And all I'm going to say about this is that too many people start off at too high of an intensity and it's too hard and they get injured or they get demotivated, they get burnt out. The thing you want to think about here is, especially when it comes to exercises, like I see people in the gym all the time, they're unfit, they haven't trained, and they're starting off with like jumps onto boxes, or they're like jumping off of boxes and they're doing full sprints and stuff like that. That is a recipe for injury. Your risks are way higher to get injured if you start like that. So what I would encourage you to do is you have to gradually increase your intensity. And intensity is measured in different ways. So if you're running, it could be speed. I'll share this. I wasn't going to share this. What I was actually thinking of doing, Lauren, and I haven't talked to you about this, is maybe do like a part 2 to this so I can dive deeper into some of these things that we're talking about here. But this metric, this acronym, is called FIT-VP. What it stands for is frequency, intensity, the time, the type of training, the variation, and the progression. And all this means is that you can change your training in different ways. So you might start off training 2 times a week, and to increase your stimulus, you go to 3 times a week and then to 4 times a week. Your intensity, if you're running, could be your speed. It could be your distance. It could be many different things. So the idea here is you want to progressively overload these variables. You don't want to go 100% 0 to 100. That's risking injury. So that's the first thing. The next thing I want to talk about is this acronym called SAID. SAID stands for specific adaptations to imposed demands. and in case anyone's writing it down, I'll give you guys a second to write it down. What this means is that whatever you're doing, you're going to get fitter at that. So if I'm riding the bike for all of my cardiovascular training, I'm going to get fitter from a cardiovascular perspective, but it's not going to be a one-for-one translation onto the squash court. So if I get 2 times fitter on a bike, I might get 20 to 30% fitter on the squash court, but I've built my base by doing this. And it's essential to have a high foundation, and then you can transfer your fitness to make it sport specific. Okay, so specific adaptations of imposed demands, very important. That applies for cardiovascular stuff. It also applies for strength training. So squash has very specific types of angles that we work at. So generally speaking, in like if you watch professional players when they lunge, they don't let, for the most part, they don't let their knees go over their toes when they're lunging, because that's a disadvantageous position. So if you're in the gym and you're training lunges and you're constantly training with your knees going well over your toes, it's, again, this principle of specific adaptation to imposed demands isn't going to work. You're going to get strong at that angle. You're not going to necessarily get strong at the angle that you want relative to your sport. So that's another thing that I'd encourage you guys to keep in mind. Now, let me see. The next thing, and this is an example. So keeping these ideas in mind, one thing I'd suggest that you guys think about is that whenever you train, your weakest link is going to be what's called connective tissue. And these are your tendons and your ligaments and stuff like that. So muscles actually get strong and adapt really fast, and tendons and ligaments are way slower at adaptation. So if you go and you put this crazy load, or you don't warm up adequately enough, you may not pull a muscle, but you might strain or aggravate or tear, at worst case scenario, a tendon, because they don't adapt and get stronger as quickly as muscles. So this is something to really think about. And this is where the progressive overload idea is critical in order to make sure your connective tissue is strong enough. So the practical example for that would be, if you're doing a strength training program, you want to get into the gym, and I'm going to talk about this later, but I'll mention it now. One thing that works really, really well are what are called isometric exercises. And all that means is that you are holding exercises. So if you're doing a squat, you're not actually going up and down all the time in the squat. You get into a squat and you just hold that position at the bottom of a squat. By doing that, your tendons actually get really strong. Your muscles will get stronger too, but this is a scientifically proven way to increase your tendon strength. And you can do that for your upper body, your lower body, all of that stuff. And then if you take that SAID principle, specific adaptations of imposed demands, you could do all of your static holds at angles that work well for squash, as an example, if you're holding a lunge. So the key from all of this, I'm sharing this and I'm being cognizant of time because I don't want to spend too long on this, but I wanted to share this because these are critical things to think about when you're planning your training. Because you might go and say, okay, yeah, I'm going to train. And you know, I've done this for many years of my life. Like, okay, I'm going to go train. And when I was 17, 18, I'd go train for like 5-6 hours a day, but I was training on the bike a lot. I was training, doing like bodybuilding style weightlifting. And only later in my life did I realize that, yeah, okay, I'm getting stronger and I'm getting fitter, but it's not going to be as beneficial compared to if I actually did it in an effective way using the things we just talked about, especially the stress part for me, because every time I trained that hard, after 2-3 months, I would end up with an injury, like without fail. So things to keep in mind, please. A format or a structure. Actually, before I go on, any questions? Am I going too fast? Or
Yeah,
I think Kathy had one.
Kathy. Okay, awesome.
Yeah, sorry, I did have one. I just was typing it in the chat, but if you don't have time to look at the chat, I was just asking if you were going to give us some specific squash exercises according to SAID.
Yes, I will. I'm going to share, I'm going to share general ones at the end, but what I'm going to share is how you can make them specific to squash based on like the example I gave with the lunge. So you could do lunges, for example, but you want to do the lunge in a particular angle. And I'm going to share that stuff with you for sure. And then I will share specific examples of like cardiovascular stuff, the types of intervals you could do at different times and how to build through them and stuff. And if I don't answer it, please let me know afterwards. Anyone else have a question? And thank you, Lauren. If you do see anything in the chat, because I didn't see it.
I'll interrupt you.
Yes. And Kathy, I see you now. I see the biggest stress right now is not playing squash. So the best thing you can do is to try to simulate that in the best way possible. And we can talk about some of that as well. It's not going to be, I mean, if you're really keen, you can go into your garage or your driveway or something and start doing some ghosting and whatnot too, right? But that's if you're really keen. Most people don't have that degree of kind of desire and motivation because it's not fun per se. But I'll share examples with you guys for sure. So the thing that I want to get you guys to think about is following framework when you're thinking about your fitness. So you want to think about your starting point or your starting fitness levels, your experience that you have with training, many things. You want to think about your goals. So are you trying to become a national champion in your age category? Are you playing recreationally? Do you want to become a professional athlete? Do you want to win a world masters tournament? Like, I don't know what your goals are. You got to think about that because these things are going to dictate how often you train, how structured it needs to be, all of that. You got to be specific with your training. You got to be realistic. And this is the key: consistent. So inconsistent training will give you inconsistent results, and it increases your chances of injury as well. Because if you work really hard, you're not fully conditioned, higher chances of injury because you're getting right into it. And if you work hard and then you take a break and then you come back and in your mind, you're like, oh yeah, I was training at this intensity. Well, chances of injury just go up like crazy as well. So if you haven't been doing much over this lockdown, I would highly encourage you to think like you're a kid and you haven't had much training experience and you got to start kind of from the base. So that would be really important. And then there's an effective way to structure training. And truthfully, I was going to go into a little bit more of this, but I realized that I probably wouldn't have time. So probably in part 2, assuming we do part 2, hopefully, Lauren, I think it should be fine. I'll get more into this idea because there's this science called periodization. And it's a way, and you guys can Google it and read about it if you're really keen, but it's a way to structure your training effectively. But what periodization really does is take progressive overload that we talked about, and it takes the SAID principle and it just puts it in kind of like a framework over the course of a year for you. So you know how to shift up your training as you go. And then this one is big. So I'd encourage you to assess your risk versus your reward. So the example I'll give you is plyometrics, or like explosive exercises where you do a lot of jumping. There's like the most advanced version of plyometric. One of them are what are called depth jumps. So imagine someone is, you're going to love my drawings. Imagine someone is standing on top of a box and they step down from the box. And as soon as you land on the ground, you got to jump as high as possible. So what you're trying to do here is simulate a ton of force into the ground and then explode as quickly as possible. So I'm not saying that this is an ideal squash example, but I'm just using this as an example. This for vertical jumping has been shown to be really effective for vertical jumping, okay? But it's a very advanced technique because you need to have a ton of strength. You need to have a ton of training experience. You need to be able to absorb load. Your technique needs to be correct, all sorts of stuff. You might get amazing, rewards by doing this. You might increase your vertical jump, but your risk of injury is so high unless you are really well trained that I would probably not recommend this for anyone. Like, I don't know your history, but even I don't do a ton of depth jumps. And even professional athletes that do depth jumps only do them at limited times of the year because they put a lot of strain on your body, especially on top of everything you're already doing. So instead of this, you might think about like skipping or jumping rope, whatever you want to call it. That is a low impact plyometric exercise that actually simulates not the exact movement in squash, but a common consistent movement in squash. So when you think about squash, I don't know how much you guys know about the split step. Maybe it's a verbiage thing. I'm sure you guys all know a bit about it. You're on the tee, you take a little hop, and when you see players run, they're generally moving on the balls of their feet. They're not moving on the heels of their feet. So what does skipping do? In skipping, you're on the balls of your foot when you're constantly skipping. So that, even though it's not a direct correlation of, hey, I'm moving while I'm skipping, I mean, you can move while you skip, but even though the goal is that you're just bouncing around when you're skipping on the balls of your foot, that simulates that movement that you're going to have in squash. So low intensity plyometrics like skipping are actually really, really helpful. Now, how long, let me put this question now based on what we've talked about. How long do you guys think you should skip for the first time you go out and you start skipping? Or how would you structure a skipping workout? There's no right or wrong. I mean, there kind of is based on what we talked about, but I'm not going to.
Not sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, not sure how long, but definitely start slow and take breaks. Like, don't do a full set right away. Let your body rest.
Okay, so take breaks. Okay, that's very good. Anyone else want to share anything? No? I'm going to start calling on you guys. I'm really good at that. Fabio, any ideas, sir?
Well, the only thing I can add is I tried skipping and I did a two minute on, 1 minute off, and like 3 times I was gassed. So that's not, that wasn't good. So I know that's wrong.
2 minutes. So now this is what I'd encourage you to think about. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It might not be best for you, given your experience with skipping and given your, like, how much you've been training and haven't been training. So I think about that. But 2 minutes is a long time to skip, to be honest. Like, most people will struggle to skip for 2 minutes. Now, I'm going to share something. So I have this, you know how I told you guys I do this mindset program? I have this program, I call it the Life Strong program. And one of the modules in there is on fitness. So I took a slide that I put over there and it's a perfect time to talk about it based on what you just said, Fabio. So I'm going to, I don't know if this is going to paste on the whiteboard actually. So what I can do is maybe I'll share my screen. Let me see if I can paste it. I don't think it's going to work. No, it's not going to work. So I'm going to share this screen. It's the screen with my notes. So don't read my notes because then you're going to ruin the surprise of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to stop or new share. And here we go. Can you guys see my screen? Okay, so it says your fitness goals. I don't know, maybe I can enlarge it a bit. So this is just a slide from that module that I created on fitness. And you notice over here, what I suggest the students to do is analyze the game. So you're thinking about how long are my average rallies? What are my typical movements that I'm making? What major muscles are used? What's the duration of my match? What kind of positions do I find myself in? Is it a symmetrical or asymmetrical sport? I mean, you guys can read it. I don't know why I'm reading it out to you. So when you think about this, so Fabio, you gave your example. You would do 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. Are any of your rallies 2 minutes long?
No.
No. How long would you say a typical rally is for you? Just
30,
an estimate.
Like 30 seconds?
Yeah, maybe. And depending on your level, I obviously don't know your level. Oftentimes, rallies aren't even 30 seconds. Like, average rallies for professionals are like 14 seconds or something like that. So yeah, you have the occasional like 2 minute, killer rally, but on average they're like 10, 15, 20 seconds. So now, and then how long do you think the rest is between rallies?
It's like 15 to 20 seconds.
Yeah, like max. So when you think about that, so let's say your average rally is 20 seconds, your rest is 20 seconds. Well, now the next time you do skipping, instead of 2 minutes on, 1 minute off, just by taking this, forgetting everything else, by taking this, you might do 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off. And all of a sudden, it's far more realistic, relevant to the sport, right?
If you don't mind me asking, so I started doing some interval training where I was doing 60 on, 30 off.
Yep.
Is my thinking right that if I do longer than what my rally is, that much better for the rally, or should I just try to match it to exactly what my rally is and just try to make the length of my workout longer instead of the load?
So this is a huge question. So I'm going to try to give it like as simply as possible. Your rationale for longer longer work, so increasing the load, it makes sense. Now, you know how we talked about like aerobic and anaerobic stuff? So aerobic is kind of like your base that allows you to go for as long as you can. And it also helps with your recovery. So the stronger your aerobic system is, the quicker you will recover. If your aerobic system is weak, and I'm not saying yours is, I'm just saying if someone's aerobic system is weak, those ratios, you actually have specific work to rest ratios that are ideal to build the aerobic system. So it all comes back to knowing ourselves and what our weaknesses or strengths are. Whereas like, so if you tell me your aerobic system is like a powerhouse, you can go out there and you can be on court for 2 hours and you're not gassed. And then I'll be like, okay, that sounds like your aerobic system is pretty strong. But you tell me when I get into these like hard, fast rallies, I just get gassed and they wipe me out. Then I would say your aerobic system is probably pretty strong, but your anaerobic system is not that strong. And depending on which system needs more work, your intensity of training and your work to rest ratios vary a lot. Okay. So I'm going to get into this in a minute. I'm going to go back to the whiteboard for a second, and I'm going to share some stuff with you guys. This is good. That was a great question because it's kind of going in a very linear fashion. I like that. I don't know if you guys wrote down anything from the slide. You're welcome to think about those things because then you can structure your training accordingly. If you didn't get a chance to write it down, I can share it via email with you guys later, so you guys can have that for reference. So here, let me tell you guys one thing, and I'm going to get to your question in more detail in a second, Fabio. So some practical tips. There's this thing called rate of perceived exhaustion, RPE. And sometimes you see it on a scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes it's from 6 to 20, I believe. What a lot of research has shown is that if you maintain approximately a 3 or a 4 out of 10, and what this means is that you can actually hold a conversation with someone, you are working your AE, aerobic system. Okay, so that's a very simple way of knowing that you're working your aerobic system. Yeah, it might not be like 100% pinpoint accurate, but it'll give you a very good estimate. The only like 100% pinpoint accurate way is to like go into a VO2 max test, which is expensive and you don't need to do it. Now, if you want to work your anaerobic system, research has shown that if you're around a 7 or an 8 out of 10, and you can maybe say, just say a few words, that's anaerobic. So, like an anaerobic might look like, I'm on the bike and I can be safe and, I can't really, like that's anaerobic because you're not getting enough oxygen into your muscles to be able to be able to communicate effectively, essentially, and your muscles can't recover. And when you're in that anaerobic state, you are going to burn out eventually if you keep it up. I'm not going to get into the details. We can do this in part 2, but there's a huge link to nutrition when it comes to this kind of stuff, because the aerobic system uses if you're well trained, it'll primarily use fat as a fuel for you. And the anaerobic system, I'm just writing CHO for carbs. The anaerobic system primarily uses carbohydrates for fuel for you. And really the reason I'm mentioning this is because, nowadays there are lots of people talking about like keto diets and this and that, where it's like basically little to no carbs. If you're doing really intense work and you're doing anaerobic work where you're like gasping and you can't really talk and stuff, your body needs carbohydrates for energy. So if you are not eating carbohydrates and you are doing really intense workout, you're setting yourself up for some kind of disaster. Either you're going to burn out, you're not going to have the energy levels, you're not going to be put into quality training, your muscles and all probably aren't going to recover, you're going to feel exhausted. All of those things are going to happen. If you're primarily in this 3 or 4 out of 10 in the aerobic zone, well, then you probably don't need as many carbs. It's probably still good to have some carbs, in my opinion. The brain needs carbs and stuff like that. So I'm not saying one diet is good or bad. I'm just saying, depending on the intensity of your training, the types of training you're doing, you may want to consider the type of food you are eating, because there is a link to those things. And the challenge with this, without getting into too much science, you have a limited store of carbohydrates in your system. Carbs are only stored in your muscles and in the liver, and there's a limited amount. Fat is all over our body, and there's each gram of fat gives you way more calories, gives you way more energy than a gram of carbs as well. So you just have far more access to energy with fat, but you can only use fat at a low intensity of training. It's harder to use fat. You can't use fat primarily at a high intensity of training. Let's put it that way. So that's something to think about. So Fabio, remind me of your question again.
Yeah, so the question was, because I've heard high intensity training or interval training is great for squash.
Yeah.
If we do longer load in shorter time versus the actual squash.
Yeah. Okay.
Rally time.
Right. Okay. So thank you for reminding me. I didn't want to butcher it, so I just asked you again. So this rate of perceived exhaustion thing is critical based on your starting point. So like I said, if your aerobic base is weak, you don't need to get into like 2-to-1 work to rest ratios. You actually might want to have either, depending on what you like, steady state, so like continuous long kind of endurance stuff, or you can do like even 4-5 minute intervals. But the key with this is that the intensity is lower. Okay, so this is where this idea of periodization that I talked about structure comes into play. Because when you're first starting off, you might want to do these 4 to 5 minute intervals for 4 to 6 weeks. I'm making this up, so just as an example, you might want to do them for 4 to 6 weeks, and you might do 4 to 5 minutes on. You might do 1 minute as like active recovery maybe, or it could be passive where you're just kind of standing there. That's totally fine. And then you might want to repeat this for like 20 or 30 minutes or 40, 50 minutes, depending on your baseline, right? That's why it's hard to say until I know each of your individual fitness levels. And then by doing this for 4 to 6 weeks, or even up to like, let's say 8 weeks, your aerobic base is going to get a lot stronger. Once your aerobic base is strong enough, then you can get into what you mentioned here, where you're doing like 2 minutes on, 1 minute off at a high intensity. But the thing here is that work to rest ratios, the way you change work to rest and the way you change intensity determines what impact your training is going to have. Okay. So high work to rest ratio, meaning you're doing like 5 minutes on, 1 minute off, your intensity needs to be low. And maybe your intensity is like 60%. It might be that like 3 out of 10, let's say. As you get comfortable with this over time, you change the ratios. So instead of 5 minutes on, 1 minute off, you might do what you were saying, 2 minutes on, 1 minute off. But now your intensity might be 75%, which might be like a 5 or a 6 out of 10. That math makes no sense, so please ignore that. That's a 5 or a 6 out of 10. So that's how you want to think about it. This gets really complicated pretty fast because there are many different energy systems and there are different ways to target the different energy systems. So now in squash, it goes back to that slide that I showed you. What are the typical rally lengths? What is the rest? You want to kind of gear it towards that, because a professional's rally length and rest looks very different from an amateur's rally length or rest, which looks very different from an elite junior's rally length or rest. So eventually you want to try to cater it specific to your needs to get the best bang for buck with that said principle. But the key is you always want to start off with a strong aerobic base, and then over time you work the anaerobic. And the general way this works is you have high work to rest ratios in the aerobic, and then you have the opposite over here. So I'll give you an example. It's like 5 to 1. And then this over here, when you're going like crazy anaerobic, if you want to work only speed, let's say, this might not be super relevant for squash all the time, but if you want to work only speed, you might be doing like, 10 seconds on, but you might be resting for 60 to 90 seconds. But that's like only speed, which again, you might not do a lot of for squash because you don't need just pure linear speed for squash. But for squash, you might do a lot of the 20 on and maybe 15 off. And This speed example I gave you is like, that's max effort. This example I gave you here, 2015, might be like a 95%. So it's not quite like full out, or might be 90%, depending on kind of your training experience and your fitness levels. So that's how you want to think about this. So this is a continuum where your ratio flips when you go from aerobic to anaerobic, and your intensity is inversely related. So low intensity at aerobic and high intensity for anaerobic.
Ahad, Kathy
Yes,
has a
yes.
question.
Yes. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could recommend what activities we're talking about when you're trying to build your aerobic, like what kinds of things you're doing, like to
sure.
You know,
It could be
and for the anaerobic.
Yeah. It could be, so you can do these in any way that you prefer. So if you're like running, you could do it running. If you like cycling, you could do it cycling. Swimming, you could be on the elliptical, you could be on the rowing machine, you could even do it skipping. If you build up like 5 minutes of skipping continuously is like really challenging, and the joints and the muscles might not tolerate that if you haven't been doing it. But you could do it in any way. But going back, the thing I would encourage you to think about is that SAID principle. So if you're swimming for fitness, swimming is a totally different medium that you're also operating in. So swimming may not translate as optimally to squash, but if you are, depending on how serious you are with your training, if you know that you're not going to be competing or anything like that for a while, you could swim when you know you're not going to be playing a tournament for a while, because it's fine. It's going to build your cardiovascular system. But as you get closer to needing to play more on the squash court, you want to transfer your training to something that's more specific to squash. And the most specific thing is to do ghosting, to just play the game, to do drills, to do stuff like that. So, and this is that whole periodization talk that I didn't get into just for the sake of time today. But in your, let's say in your off season is where you're going to work on your aerobic base. In your off season, or when you have time away from competition, is when you're going to work on those hold exercises I alluded to earlier, where you're building your tendons and everything like that. You could build your aerobic base on the bike. You could do it however you want. But as you get closer, a couple of months out from tournaments, you want to start shifting your training onto the squash court. And the one thing that I've honestly didn't realize until very late in my squash career was that by playing condition games, by playing matches, by doing all those things, I am maintaining my fitness. Now, I'm not going to probably increase my fitness by just doing my drills and stuff, although there are ways to do that too. Like there's one drill that I used to do when I was working on my aerobic base, and I would set a timer for 5 minutes, and we would just do like rotating drives for 5 minutes, or we would just play a length game for 5 minutes. And if someone didn't get the ball, you don't even stop the serve. You literally, you pick it up on 2 bounces and you just keep going. Now that's very tiring, so I wouldn't recommend that. Because and it's not easy to control that, because if one person is stronger than the other person, well, then one person is no longer in the aerobic zone. They're working like crazy, right? So it becomes anaerobic. So you need to be of someone with equal skill. You need to have enough ball control to kind of keep that going and all that kind of stuff. But that would be an example of how you can actually train your aerobic fitness in a very sport specific way. Okay. And then you could do the same thing where you could say, we're just going to play games, and that's going to maintain your anaerobic fitness, because that's literally exactly what you're going to be doing. But you could build up your anaerobic fitness by doing the bike sprints, or by doing, track sprints or hill sprints, or, whatever it is that you enjoy doing. You could build, or even like, if you're really good at skipping, you could do very aggressive skipping for like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, or 15 seconds off, and just do repetitions of that. And you're building your anaerobic fitness in a somewhat squash specific way. So that's how you would kind of work those things. Does that make sense? Okay. Man, we're having lots of conversations. We might go a little bit over. I don't know if you guys have a hard deadline at 6:30. I could probably go a little bit longer if you guys want. I'll say very quickly, let me clear this whiteboard. Couple of things to keep in mind when you're thinking about your training. Think about your soreness the next day. If you're very sore, you did too much. So track what you're doing, do less the next time. You don't want to be operating in like crazy soreness all the time because you're pushing your body too hard. It's not recovering enough. That's going to lead to injury, burnout, all that stuff we talked about. So that's something important to monitor. You want to think about your motivation. So if your motivation levels are going down when you're training, it means you're doing too much. You want to be doing enough where you still feel motivated. You still want to get out and do things. This is linked to overtraining syndrome, which a lot of athletes struggle with. So motivation is key. A sample structure that could work for you. It's a generic structure you can think about. I personally use it as well. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you could do like harder training days, and harder training days could be, it's different person to person. Tuesday, Thursday are like light or active recovery days. So specifically on light active recovery days, what you could be doing would be like mobility work. You could work on your core. You could work on like a light aerobic session. So light aerobic sessions actually help with recovery, but this would be like a 2 out of 10. If you're riding the bike, 2 out of 10 for like 10 to 30 minutes, depending on your fitness levels. This can actually help promote recovery. So this is what you do on your light days. Once we're back on a squash court, this could be like a light solo hit for like 20 minutes or something like that. On the harder days, this is where you're doing your intervals, you're doing your match play, you're doing the tougher gym work. So this is where you're doing the hard training sessions. So a lot of professionals will usually do like 2 sessions per day. I'm sure you can hear the little one in the background. You're doing 2 sessions a day, and they could be 2 hard sessions a day. But then on the next day, they're generally doing something a little bit lighter. Or if they've really built up their fitness a lot, they might do several hard days, but they'll make sure they get a light day or a total rest day, at least 1 day in the week, because you need to give yourself. But again, this is where it gets tricky, because if you're looking at a professional's training week or training log, don't ever try to do what someone else is doing, because they've probably spent the last 10 or 15 years of their lives gradually, progressively overloading to build up to that. And I've made this mistake. I remember I was super enthusiastic when I was younger, and I watched this video of this legendary Pakistani squash player named Jahangir Khan. And this guy would go and do like 24 400-meter sprints, like back-to-back kind of thing, 400 meters on, like one off. And Jeff Hunt and several other people did this. And I got super inspired. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna go do a bunch of these. And I did like 10 or 12 of them. And I had never done this. And I was never a runner. And I just totally destroyed my tendon, my patellar tendon around my knee. And I was like limping for 2 months. I couldn't walk properly for ages because my body couldn't tolerate that load. It was a new exercise for me. That intensity wasn't there. I didn't have the volume built up. I didn't have anything. I was like, hey, he did it. I want to be like him. I'm going to do it. Youthful foolishness. I learned my lesson pretty quickly with that one. So this is the value of knowing your body and knowing what works for you. So let me get a little bit more practical. I've already shared some practical things, but we'll keep going. The first thing you got to do is a very thorough warm-up. There are several layers to this. I'm not going to get into all the details. We can talk about this later, but this is critical. I'll just say the warm-up, the key is to raise your body temperature gradually. You want to mobilize your joints. You want to increase your heart rate gradually. So you got to get your body ready. And then there's obviously the mental side of it. So you want to prepare yourself for whatever you're about to do. So that's critical before you do stuff. Oh, the one common mistake that people make over here is static stretching. Do we want to do a lot of this before we start? No. Good. You do not want to do a lot of this before you start. Instead, you want to have a dynamic warm-up. And this just means that you might be getting into some of these like stretches and these ranges of motion, except you're not holding them for extended periods of time. You might, you might bend down to stretch your hamstrings, which you bend down and you just kind of come back up, and you bend down and you come back up. So you're just working through ranges of motion. You're not just holding it, because again, research has shown that it actually, for a lack of better words, it puts your muscles to sleep and they can't generate the same amount of force. So that's something to think about there. Now, the thing I would recommend, I'm going to make a grand assumption, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that most of us have not been that physically active over the last year. So I would highly recommend that you start off with some of the hold-based exercises that I had mentioned. So getting into a squat. Like when do you use a squat on the squash court? Or something very similar to a squat in the squash court?
Back corner.
Back corner. So you go with a 2-footed plant and you're in the back corner, you're basically in a squat. So now, do you need to do a squat where your bum is like almost at the ground? How often do you get into that kind of squat versus how often are you in a squat where maybe you're at an angle like this? This is your foot, here's your hip. Maybe you're in a squat like this. It's rare that you're going to be in a squat like this. It's rare that you're getting that low, but you might be in this kind of a position. So when you're doing your squat hold, you want to hold something that's more relevant to what you would do. Now, so here are some exercises. So a squat is really valuable. We talked already about the split step. So if we talk about skipping, that's going to be really valuable when you're to skip. So you get used to being elastic and light on your feet and you get springy. When you think of lunges, and again, I'm talking about holds over here, generally speaking, top players get into lunge positions like this. So their knees generally they're kind of like in line or behind their heels. They do not, as often as they can avoid it, get into lunge positions like this where their knees are way over their toes. Now, there actually, from what I've been learning recently and what science is showing now, is that there is value to training like this because it actually strengthens your knee joint, but it needs to be in a controlled way. From an efficiency perspective, though, you want to try to lunge like this when you're actually on the squash court. So this is where we go back to periodization. Early on in your training or in your off season, you might want to do some of this, but especially as you get closer to tournaments and getting on court, you got to be doing all of that, because this goes back to that specific adaptation to impose demands that we talked about. Is that clear? Okay, cool. So lunges, big thing for squash is rotator cuff. This is like the shoulder blade, all the muscles over there. We do a ton of stuff with the swing. So you got to make sure your shoulder blades and rotator cuff muscles are really strong. I won't get into the details of exercises. You can Google it. You'll see infinite rotator cuff exercises. A lot of them involve bands, or you can even use weights, and you're basically just kind of like moving your arm in different planes of motion to work the muscles. Next one, hamstring muscles. And I should have said squats and lunges work your glutes. Glutes are critical. They work your quads, and there's a lesser known muscle. It's called the anterior tibialis. It's the muscle at the front of the shin, basically where people get shin splints. That muscle is critical for deceleration. So that muscle gets worked through these exercises too. And you can actually, I'll write it here, anterior tibialis, in case you want to Google that. Hamstrings, super critical. Anytime you're sprinting, accelerating, the hamstrings do a ton of work. The glutes do a ton of work. Simple exercises like glute bridges are more for the glutes, but if you just move does everyone know what a glute bridge is? No. So you'll be lying down on the ground. This is your back. You're lying down on the ground, and you have your knees at around a 90-degree angle. And then what you do is you lift your hip up to kind of make a straight line with your shoulders. So you're creating a little bridge under your bum by lifting up. By doing that, you're going to fire your glutes to hold you there. You don't need to go crazy and like create a crazy arch with your body, because you don't want your lower back to start hurting, but you need to lift your hips up so that your glutes are actually doing some work over there. So that's really good. And you can just hold this for like 25 seconds, for example, and squeeze your bum, and you'll feel a burn in your bum. That's a critical muscle for squash. You can do a ton of stuff with bands and all sorts of things for your glutes, but this is a very simple one that anyone can do anywhere without any equipment. Now, if I just walk my foot out a little bit more and I put my foot here by increasing this angle, now my hamstrings get activated like crazy. So the hamstrings are kind of like the back of the thigh. Those get activated like crazy. So now doing the same exercise, basically, you can work your glutes a lot and you can work your hamstrings a lot. So here's a simple way to work your hamstrings. And again, it's critical. For anyone who has experience with weightlifting, a deadlift, and especially like single leg deadlifts, you don't need any weights, are really, really helpful because it teaches you how to like bend at your hip, strengthens your lower back. It works on your balance. It works in your hamstrings, your glutes, your quads as well, depending on how much you bend your knee. And thinking about this, actually, I would highly encourage you, if you have experience training, to do things single leg or unilaterally. So the more you can do single leg, the better it'll be also from a balance and stability perspective for you. Excuse me. It's a lot of talking. The throat's getting dry. So I don't know how many of you guys have done deadlifts before, but they're really good for this. And then a big one is the core. Now, there's a great way to work your core. You want to, and actually what I'll do is, Lauren, if you send me everyone's emails afterwards, if everyone's okay with it, I had created this complimentary like 5 video core program. Oh, pardon, excuse me for a sec. I think my little one wants to come say goodnight before she goes to bed. You guys can say hello to her really quickly. She's 2. Diana, look.
Hello.
We are friends.
Hi.
You can say hi. See, you can hear them now.
Say hi.
You can say hi to them.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, good
bedtime,
night.
Mom. Yeah.
Do you know where her little dolls are?
No. That's going to be another massacre now. Missing some little dolls.
Uh-oh.
They might be.
They're not anywhere. Did you put them in your pocket when you went out?
Maybe. Could be in my jacket.
Okay.
Sorry, this is going to be meltdown part 2 if this doesn't get resolved.
Okay, I'll look for them.
All right, take a look. She can sit with me for 2 minutes if you want to look. I hope you guys don't mind. We have an extra guest. Okay, so core. I'm going to send you guys a link to a complimentary like 5 video program that I created that takes you through the optimal ways to kind of build your core. The key is you want to build stability in your core, then you want to go to dynamic stability. And then from there, you can get into more like the strength and then power. And then if you guys like that, I've created a program as well. It's a paid program. You guys are welcome to check that out. But the one I'll send you is like a complimentary one. So you guys can get a flavor of how to train your core effectively. And then I know we're pretty much out of time. I already talked about intervals. I was going to talk about the intervals. Actually, the thing I will say is that rate of perceived exhaustion is, I had mentioned that it's like a 3 out of 10 for aerobic, and then a 7 to an 8 out of 10 for anaerobic work. And remember that the higher you get with your intensity, your work to rest ratio has to change. I'm writing stuff, John. Yeah, there's writing there. She just turned 2 a week, 10, no, how long has it been? Almost 2 weeks now. So she's getting quite communicative. It makes it fun.
Using her words.
She's using her words. She's very communicative now, actually. She's very shy when she first meets new people. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that in terms of overall content. The one thing I will say is, I want to share one more thing. I created a YouTube channel where I've been uploading these videos that are breaking down different elements of the game in a lot of detail. So like technical stuff, tactical stuff, things like that. So if you guys are interested in that, I will send you a link through Lauren and she can help with that. I'm coming in 2 minutes. Now she just wants me because she doesn't have her dolls. So I will send you the link to the YouTube video as well. So you can check out things from like serves and where your targets can be and all that sort of stuff, to tactical things, to patterns, to like all sorts of stuff kind of related to the coaching side of the game. And if any of you guys are interested and you want to learn more, or you want to work together on the fitness side of things, I am happy to work with you to like create a plan for you and all of that. Like I do personal training for athletes and non-athletes. So if you guys are interested in that, I'm happy to chat with you. And then we can go into more details like Lauren, we had mentioned maybe on another session with like periodization and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, many ways to get a hold of me online. And again, I'll share all of it through Lauren.
Ahad, if you are gonna send them that core stuff, as long I'll just assume if everyone wants to give me a thumbs up now, if you guys are okay with me giving Ahad your email.
Good.
I'll just do that and then you can send it to them.
Done. Yeah, I'll send you guys the core
cool.
stuff, the YouTube channel, and then I'll remind you again that if you want to do any kind of personal training, just I gotta embed that a little bit. Then yeah, I'm available for that.
Okay, awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, Ahad, I'll send you the emails with the people on the call for sure.
Sounds good. And does anyone have any questions?